The first crack of the whip split the air, sharp and clean. A dull thud followed, a sound that stopped me in my tracks. From the far end of the auction barn, a man yanked a thin rope, dragging something small and unsteady into view. My eyes narrowed. I couldn't see much at first, just a frail shadow stumbling into the harsh fluorescent light. The creature faltered, knees buckling, but the man didn't seem to care. He tugged again, hard this time, muttering a curse under his breath. And then I saw him. The horse, if you could call it that, was barely standing. His coat, once white, was now a patchy, matted mess of grime and sweat. His head hung so low it nearly brushed the floor, and when he tried to lift it, I noticed the ooze dripping from his jaw. It was yellowish, tinged with red. I knew right then the infection had probably spread deep, and it must have been hurting him like hell. But it wasn't just the pus that made my stomach turn. There were marks, long, jagged scars crisscrossing his legs and back, cuts that had healed ugly and wrong. Bruises spotted his ribs, like someone had been too quick with a boot or a stick. I felt my fists clench at my sides. "Lot 47!" The auctioneer's voice boomed, cutting through the hum of restless buyers. "One-of-a-kind opportunity here, folks. Needs a little TLC, huh? But a bargain's a bargain." A round of muffled chuckles followed. I didn't laugh. The little survivor, flinched at the noise, his ears flattened, his tail tucked tight. And when a man nearby shifted his foot, the sound of boots scraping against concrete sent him skittering sideways into the rail. His side smacked against it with a hollow thunk, and I saw it. Pure terror in his eyes, wide, wet, and empty, like he didn't expect a single good thing to come from this world anymore. I felt it in my chest, like a hand twisting my insides. "Lot 47, ladies and gents. Who's going to start me off at $50? The auctioneer grinned as though the little horse were nothing more than an old tool someone had forgotten in their shed. The man holding the rope stepped aside and gave it some slack. The horse's knees wobbled as if freedom might be worse than being tethered. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. A voice, raspy and loud, piped up from somewhere in the crowd. "Looks like he's halfway to glue already." Laughter erupted, cruel and careless. I swallowed hard, my teeth grinding together. $40, the auctioneer barked. "Come on now, folks, that's a steal." The horse twitched, his eyes darting between the voices. He didn't look real, not in the way healthy animals do. He looked like a ghost, like something hollowed out and left behind. I told myself to keep walking. I wasn't here for this. I didn't need this. There was no plan for a broken-down pony in my barn. I didn't have the time, the money, or the strength for another rescue. But my feet didn't move. Another voice spoke up. "20!" The crowd laughed again. My chest tightened, and before I realized what I was doing, I stepped forward. 25. The auctioneer's eyes snapped to me. 25! That's more like it. Do I hear 30? I wasn't prepared for all the heads turning my way, their stares heavy with judgment, or worse, pity. Someone near me snorted, "What's she going to do, knit it a sweater?" 30? The auctioneer pressed. Silence. He gave me a toothy grin. "Sold! Lot 47! $25! The gavel cracked against wood, final and loud. The horse startled, stumbling into the rail again with a painful-sounding thud. My throat tightened as I moved toward him. The rope was shoved into my hands, and the man holding it grumbled something under his breath. "Good luck with that one. Won't last the week." I didn't reply. I just looked at the little horse. Up close, he looked even smaller, bones and shadows barely holding together. His breath came in shallow puffs, every exhale trembling. My heart broke a little at the way he avoided my eyes, as though bracing for another blow. The drive back was silent, except for the sound of his hooves shifting nervously in the trailer behind me. I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to vanish like some kind of sad dream. I hadn't even named him yet, but as I thought back to his haunted eyes and his trembling body, one word floated through my mind: Sage. It sounded gentle, small and sturdy, just like he'd have to be to make it through what came next. When I got to the farm, I parked the truck and stepped out, my hands gripping the sides of the trailer gate. "All right, Sage, let's see what we're working with here." The moment I opened the gate, he staggered a little, blinking into the afternoon light. His coat looked worse out here, streaked with sweat and grime. He didn't move, not right away. Instead, he stood there, shaking faintly, as though he wasn't sure the ground beneath him would hold. I felt my throat tighten again. Whatever this little horse had been through, it was written on his body. And I'd be damned if I let that be the last story he had to tell. "Come on, buddy," I murmured, giving the rope the gentlest tug I could manage. "Let's get you inside." He hesitated, one hoof lifting before it set down again. But then he took a step. Just one. But it was enough to feel like hope. And sometimes that's all you need. I slipped the rope from my hand and stepped back, watching Sage take in his new surroundings. The barn was quiet except for the gentle shuffle of his hooves against the straw-covered floor. He stood there, still and unsure, his body trembling faintly. I wanted to believe he felt the safety of the space I'd made for him, but it was too soon for that. I crouched down a few feet away, my voice soft and low. "It's okay, buddy. This is home now." He flicked one ear toward me but didn't move. His ribs showed under that filthy, matted coat, and when he shifted, I could see his legs were barely holding him up. The scars on his back, deep and crisscrossed like old roads, looked almost darker in the dim light. A sharp knock on the barn door made Sage flinch violently. His head shot up, and he backed into the corner of the stall, his sides heaving. I cursed under my breath and turned to see Doc Harlow, my vet of nearly 20 years, leaning into the barn, with his usual mix of casual disinterest and cold practicality. "Looks like you've been shopping blindfolded again, huh?" Doc's voice was gravelly as ever. I frowned. "Just come take a look, will you?" Doc stepped in, his boots leaving muddy prints on the barn floor. "Where's the victim this time?" he muttered, half to himself, as he set his old leather bag down near the stall. Sage was pressed so far into the corner, he looked like he was trying to disappear. I stepped closer to the stall door, my hands held low where he could see them. "Easy, boy. It's just a check-up." Doc didn't wait. He swung the gate open and eased inside. That's when it happened. Sage's body went stiff, his ears pinned flat to his head. The moment Doc raised his hand to reach for him, Sage lunged sideways. It wasn't violent. It was terrified. His body hit the wall with a thud, and he dropped his head low like he was expecting a blow to follow. "Whoa, whoa," Doc muttered, stepping back. "He's jumpier than a squirrel in a dog park." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "He's been through a lot. Just give him a second." Doc sighed, straightening up. "You see those scars, don't you? Poor fella's been whipped to hell and back. Whoever did that ought to—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Hold his lead. I'll do what I can." It took 15 minutes before Doc could even get close. Sage shook like a leaf every time Doc's hand moved too fast. And his eyes, God, those eyes, darted around the stall, desperate for a way out. Finally, Doc crouched in front of him, one hand slowly reaching out. "Easy now. You've seen worse men than me, I promise." When Doc finished his exam, he stood and rubbed his jaw, looking grimmer than I'd hoped. "He's old," I'll have to check his teeth more closely, but they're a mess from what I can see. Infection's bad in that jaw too. I don't know how he's even been eating. I glanced at Sage, who was now standing frozen, his thin sides rising and falling. What's the prognosis? Doc pulled off his gloves with a snap. You want me to be honest? I didn't answer, just stared at him. This horse isn't going to make it through winter, not in this state. He's half-starved, infected, and old as dirt. You're throwing good money after bad, kid. I felt my stomach drop. There's a chance, though. There has to be. Doc's face softened, just a little. Look, I know you've got a big heart, but sometimes it's too late. I've seen enough animals go down this road. He turned back to his bag and packed up his tools. Keep him fed. Clean that jaw. If he doesn't eat, you call me. But don't hold your breath. As Doc left, I leaned against the stall door, feeling the weight of his words press down hard. I watched Sage, who had shrunk back into his corner again. His ears twitched, and every so often his gaze would flick toward me like he was trying to make sense of me, this strange human who wasn't yelling or swinging at him. I stayed like that for a while, just watching, until the sun dipped low enough to send streaks of gold through the cracks in the barn walls. Then I stood and grabbed a bucket of warm water and some soap. You're not going to like this, I muttered as I set the supplies down near the stall. But you're not going to like those bugs crawling on you either. I slipped back inside, rope in hand, and tried to coax him closer. Sage planted his feet, his head whipping up as soon as I reached for his side. Easy, I whispered. But he didn't believe me. The second the sponge touched his coat, he jumped hard, and my heart cracked. Every muscle in his body coiled up tight, and his eyes went wild, whites showing all the way around. When I raised my hand to move slower, he flinched so badly he nearly sat down. I stepped back, breathing hard, giving him space. You think I'm going to hit you, don't you? I murmured. It took me nearly an hour to get him half clean. By the end, I was soaked in sweat and Sage was trembling, his ribs shifting under every shaky breath. I wanted to cry for him, for the kind of life that made a creature like him think pain was all that came from human hands. As I cleaned up, a memory hit me, sudden and warm like a blanket. I could almost hear her voice, my grandma kneeling beside me as I held a half-dead kitten in my lap. Any soul worth saving is worth fighting for, she'd said, her old hands scratching under the kitten's chin. Even the ones who don't know how to trust yet. I looked back at Sage, standing there in the growing dark. His body was battered, broken, and weak. But he was still standing. We're gonna fight for you, Sage, I whispered, my voice catching, even if you don't believe it yet. And then I caught him watching me, not just watching, studying, like he wasn't sure what to make of me, but maybe, just maybe, he'd start to wonder if I was worth trusting after all. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and stared at Sage, who still stood in the same stiff posture, though he wasn't trembling as badly now. His coat was no longer a matted mess, but streaks of grime still clung stubbornly to the spots he wouldn't let me reach. I glanced at the clippers on the ground and sighed. All right, buddy. Round two. The thick, dirty winter coat had to go. Every strand seemed to carry years of neglect, a heavy layer trapping bugs and infection against his thin skin. I knew it would make him more comfortable, but the clippers buzzing in my hand sounded like an angry hornet, and Sage's eyes flared wide the second I stepped toward him. It's just a noise, I said softly, though I knew he wouldn't believe me. I crouched low to make myself smaller, letting him see me switch the clippers on and off a few times. his ears pinned flat, and his head whipped side to side, searching for an escape. Every muscle was taut, as though he was bracing for pain. I swallowed hard. I know you think I'm here to hurt you, but I swear, I'm not. I inched closer, step by step, until I could place one hand on his neck. I felt him flinch beneath my touch. The first pass of the clippers made him jerk so suddenly that I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. He snorted loudly, backing into the stall corner, his chest heaving. I held my ground, staying calm, even though my hands shook a little. Hey, it's okay. I know you're scared. It took over 2 hours to shave him down. 2 long, exhausting hours of coaxing, patience, and stopping every time he got too worked up. By the end of it, Sage looked small. Smaller, if that was even possible. Without the bulk of his thick coat, he was just skin and bones, his ribs protruding like sharp lines against his sides. I could see every old scar, every mark left by whoever had hurt him. My chest ached just looking at him. When I finally stood back, Sage lowered his head, his ears flicking nervously. I offered him a small handful of hay to distract him, and for once, he didn't refuse it. That's better, I murmured, more to myself than to him. We'll get you cleaned up, one step at a time. The next hurdle was feeding him. Doc's words rang in my ears every time I mixed up a batch of his special mash. He won't make it through winter. That wasn't an option. I soaked the alfalfa pellets and beat pulp until it turned soft, almost mushy, then carried the bucket over to his stall. The smell of the feed was sweet, almost earthy, but when I set the bucket down in front of Sage, he stared at it like he didn't know what to do. He sniffed the air, one nostril twitching. Come on, boy. Just a bite, I said, crouching beside him. My voice was softer now, as though I could coax him into trusting me. It's good for you, I promise. But he didn't move. He didn't eat. I watched the minutes stretch on, my heart sinking further with each passing second. When he finally turned his head away, I sighed, frustration building in my chest. You've got to eat, I whispered, standing back up. If you don't, I can't help you. The next 3 days were the same. I'd sit in the stall with him, holding out handfuls of mash and watching helplessly as he ignored it. My mind raced with every horrible possibility. What if he'd given up? What if his body was too far gone to recover? One night, as I sat slumped against the stall wall, my grandmother's voice floated back to me, clear as day. Animals don't always trust right away. You gotta show them they're safe, that you'll stick around no matter what. Sometimes, love's the only medicine that works. She used to say that when I was a kid, sitting beside her on the porch swing with a stray kitten in my lap. I'd grown up watching her nurse every broken bird, wounded dog, and abandoned cat that found its way to her doorstep. I hadn't understood it then, but I did now. The next morning, I changed my approach. I stayed quiet, letting Sage see me mix the mash. I didn't push the bucket toward him or try to get in his space. Instead, I sat a little ways away and just waited. Finally, as the sun started to peek through the barn window, Sage stepped forward. His head lowered, his nostrils flared, and after a few tense seconds I heard it, the faintest sound of his lips brushing against the mash. My breath caught, and I stayed perfectly still, afraid to break the moment. That's it, I whispered. Good boy. When Doc came back later that week, Sage was eating better, but the infection in his jaw was still bad. Doc pried open Sage's mouth with steady hands, shaking his head as he examined the damage. Teeth are a mess, Doc muttered. I'll need to pull a few out of there. Infection's been festering too long. I winced as Doc worked, the sounds of tools scraping and Sage's soft snorts of pain setting my teeth on edge. It took nearly an hour, but when Doc finally stepped back, he let out a long breath. "That should help him," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Won't be perfect, but at least he won't be in so much pain. Keep his food soft, keep an eye on that jaw, and for God's sake, don't let him backslide." I nodded, reaching out to scratch Sage's neck. "He'll make it," I said firmly, as much to Doc as to myself. Doc didn't argue, but I caught the look he gave me, half pity, half doubt, before he left. That night, as I sat by Sage's stall, I watched him take slow bites of his mash, chewing carefully. For the first time since I'd brought him home, he didn't flinch when I raised my hand to adjust his blanket. He was still wary, still small and broken, but for the first time, I let myself believe he might make it. "Good boy," I murmured, my voice soft. "We're not done yet. Not by a long shot." It had been 3 weeks since I'd brought Sage home. 3 weeks of quiet mornings and long afternoons, of small victories measured in careful steps and cautious bites of food. The barn didn't feel so heavy anymore, and neither did Sage. I leaned against the stall door, watching him as he stood in the center of his space. He wasn't pressed into a corner anymore, wasn't cowering from every sound or shadow. His coat was still thin, his ribs still visible, but there was a shine in his eyes now, something I hadn't seen before. Life. The kind of life that had been squeezed out of him by whoever had come before me. I didn't take any of it for granted. "Look at you," I said softly, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "You're not half the ghost you used to be." Sage flicked an ear at the sound of my voice, but didn't startle. That alone was progress. He pawed at the ground, his hoof tapping the dirt in a way that seemed deliberate, like he had a point to make. I laughed under my breath. "All right, buddy. I get it. You're bored." The truth was, he'd outgrown the stall. What had once been a safe, quiet box now felt too small, too still for a horse finally finding his footing. I'd spent the better part of last night working by lantern light, building out a small turnout pen just beyond the barn doors. Nothing fancy, just a space where he could move, feel the sun on his back, and maybe start to remember what freedom felt like. I pushed open the stall gate, holding the rope loose in my hand. Sage watched me, wary as ever, but he didn't retreat when I stepped toward him. "Come on," I murmured, giving the rope a gentle tug. "Let's show you something new." The sun was bright outside, the kind of crisp spring morning that made the world feel fresh and clean. Sage hesitated at the barn's threshold, his hooves planted firmly just shy of the doorway. His head lifted, nostrils flaring as he took in the open air, the smell of grass and dirt and a breeze that carried none of the stale memories he'd been used to. "It's just outside," I whispered, though my voice caught in my throat. He didn't trust it yet. I could see it in his body, the tension in his legs, the way his eyes darted toward every sound. I knew what he was thinking. Out there wasn't safe. Out there was where the pain happened. For a moment, I wondered if he'd move at all, but then he shifted, his ears twitching toward the sounds of birds overhead. And just like that, he took a step forward. Then another. I let the rope slide through my hands as he walked, letting him lead himself out of the dark and into the light. The turnout pen wasn't much, just a patch of dirt and scrubby grass surrounded by fencing. But to Sage, it must have felt like an entire country. He stood there for a long time, head high, ears swiveling to take in every new noise. I leaned against the gate and watched him, my chest swelling with something I couldn't name. Slowly, He lowered his head and sniffed at the ground, lips brushing against the tufts of grass. His tail swished lazily behind him, and when he took a step, his hooves sank into the soft earth instead of the hard barn floor. Then, out of nowhere, he did it. He trotted. It wasn't much, just a few uneven strides, but it was the first time I'd seen him move like that. The rope went slack in my hands as I watched him break into a clumsy little canter, dust kicking up in his wake. I couldn't help it. I laughed out loud, the sound spilling out of me like I'd been holding it back for years. "Attaboy, Sage," I called, grinning like an idiot. "Show him what you got." He stopped a few feet away, head turned toward me, and for a second I swore I saw it. That flicker of mischief. He swished his tail again, pawed at the dirt like he was getting ready for a show. Then, as if to prove me wrong, he dropped to the ground and rolled. "Seriously?" I muttered, half laughing as I watched him wiggle on his back like a dog. Dust clung to his thin coat, undoing half my hard work from the week before. When he finally scrambled back to his feet, he shook himself off with a grunt, sending dirt flying. I folded my arms over the gate and shook my head. "You're lucky I like you." Later that afternoon, I sat in the barn aisle with a bucket of brushes and a rasp for his hooves. Sage stood calmly beside me, his lead tied just loose enough that he could move if he wanted. I started with his mane, working the brush carefully through the tangles. He stood still, though every now and then his skin twitched under my hand, like he couldn't decide if he liked it or not. "It's just a brush," I murmured, my voice soft. "No one's here to hurt you." When I moved to his hooves, he got fussy again, shifting his weight back and forth like he wanted to protest. I sighed and knelt beside him, running my hand down his leg. "You're stubborn. You know that." As I worked, I thought about all the scars I'd seen on his body, the memories he carried from a life that hadn't given him much of a chance. And yet, here he was, eating, moving, even getting a little sassy. It was more than I could have hoped for. When I finished, I stepped back and looked him over. His coat wasn't perfect yet, but it was cleaner, shinier. His mane was smooth, his tail combed through, and his hooves trimmed just enough to keep him steady. He looked like a horse again. Sage turned his head toward me, his dark eyes calm and steady. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I swore I saw a challenge there, like he was daring me to try and fix him all the way. I smiled faintly, reaching out to scratch the spot behind his ears. "You're not so bad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not so bad at all." And when his head leaned into my hand, just a little, I let myself believe that he might actually trust me someday. Maybe not yet, but soon. I knew Pip was trouble the moment I saw her slink through the barn door. The little tabby cat had a way of sneaking into every corner of my life, and once she set her sights on something, or someone, there was no stopping her. This time, her target was Sage. It started the morning after I'd trimmed Sage's hooves and brushed him down for the 100th time. I was standing at the barn gate, sipping coffee and watching Sage munch on his mash, when I noticed a streak of orange dart across the dirt floor. I stiffened. "Pip." "No," I said, my voice low but sharp. Pip ignored me, of course. She always did. I set my mug down and stepped into the barn, trying to head her off before she got too close. "You don't want to do that, girl. He's not ready for company yet." Pip paused mid-step, her green eyes fixing on me with that same defiance she'd had since the day I found her. She was just a scrawny kitten back then, shivering under my grandmother's old porch. Grandma had been the one to wrap her in an old dish towel, tuck her into a shoebox, and tell me, "This one's got fight. You'll see." She wasn't wrong. Pip had been my shadow ever since, following me through every storm, every loss. When Grandma passed, it was just me and Pip, two stubborn survivors sticking together. And now, here she was, walking straight into Sage's stall like she owned the place. I stepped forward, arms out, like I could herd her away. "Pip, I mean it. Leave him be." She flicked her tail and trotted right past me. I cursed under my breath, already bracing for disaster. Sage had made huge strides over the past few weeks, but he was still jumpy. Loud noises, sudden movements. Anything unexpected could send him into a tailspin. A curious cat. That was asking for trouble. Pip padded closer, stopping just outside Sage's reach. She sat down on her haunches, tail wrapped around her paws, and stared at him like she was sizing him up for a fight. Sage froze mid-chew, his ears flicking forward. His head lifted slowly, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. It was like a showdown in an old western. Pip, all confidence and sass, and Sage, too startled to know whether to run or stay put. "Easy, boy," I murmured, holding my breath. Pip tilted her head, then got up and started walking again, this time straight toward Sage's feed bucket. My stomach dropped. "Oh, for crying out loud, Pip!" Before I could stop her, Sage snorted loudly, his breath stirring the air like a warning shot. Pip froze, but didn't flinch. She just looked up at him, completely unimpressed, and then did the unthinkable. She rubbed against his front leg. Sage's whole body tensed. His muscles twitched like he was ready to bolt, but his eyes never left Pip. She circled his leg once, her tail flicking against his coat, and then plopped herself down right there, as if daring him to do something about it. "Unbelievable," I muttered, leaning against the stall door. My heart was still pounding, but I couldn't help the small, disbelieving smile that tugged at my lips. "She's got you cornered, huh, buddy?" Sage stared down at Pip, his ears still pinned halfway back. But he didn't move. I stayed quiet, watching, waiting for him to decide what to do next. After a minute, he lowered his head slowly, nostrils flaring as he sniffed in Pip's direction. She didn't so much as blink. That was the start of it. For the next few days, Pip made herself Sage's self-appointed shadow. I tried to keep her out of the barn at first, shooing her away when she crept through the door, setting up barriers she always found a way around. But I may as well have tried to stop the sun from rising. Pip went where she pleased, and where she pleased was Sage's stall. At first, Sage wasn't sure what to make of her. He'd stand still, staring at her as she prowled around his legs or perched on the stall rail, watching him with her unblinking gaze. I half expected him to spook, to bolt, to fall right back into the nervous wreck I'd brought home weeks ago. But he didn't. Pip had a way of moving slow, deliberate, like she knew exactly how far she could push. She'd sit just outside his reach, licking her paw and pretending not to care, then edge a little closer when he wasn't looking. Some days, she'd sprawl out in the straw right beside him, tail swishing lazily as if she belonged there. And somehow, bit by bit, Sage started to accept her. I saw it one afternoon when I stopped by the barn to check on them. Sage was dozing in the corner of his stall, his head hanging low, his eyes half closed. Pip was curled up a foot away, her tiny frame rising and falling with each sleepy breath. When I opened the gate, Pip's head shot up, her ears pricked forward as if to say, "Don't you dare ruin this." I froze mid-step, staring at them. For the first time, Sage didn't react to me coming in. He didn't flinch or move away. He just stood there, calm as I'd ever seen him, his chest rising and falling with steady, even breaths. I let out the breath I'd been holding and whispered, Well, I'll be. You've got yourself a friend, don't you? Pip blinked at me and stretched, her claws digging into the straw. She got up and padded toward me, brushing against my leg on her way out, as if to say, "Told you so." Over the next week, I started to notice a change in Sage. He still had his moments, times when a sound or a sudden movement sent him back into himself. But they were fewer and farther between. Pip was always there, either curled up nearby or prowling around the edges of his pen, chasing mice and keeping watch. There was something about the way Sage watched her, like he didn't quite understand what she was doing, but found comfort in her presence anyway. She was small and fierce, fearless in a way he hadn't learned how to be yet, and maybe that was what he needed. I leaned against the barn door one evening, watching the two of them together. Sage standing tall for once, his eyes soft and steady, and Pip sprawled out at his feet like she owned the place. I smiled to myself and whispered, "She's good for you, you know." Sage's ear twitched, but he didn't look away. Maybe Pip had known all along. She'd survived too, after all. And if there was one thing I'd learned from her, it was that love had a way of sneaking in, whether you were ready for it or not. Time had passed faster than I thought possible. Spring had bled into summer, summer into fall, and now winter was here. Over those months, Sage and Pip had somehow become their own odd little pair. She was relentless, always prowling around his stall, batting at his tail or rubbing up against his legs like she owned him. At first, Sage ignored her completely. If anything, he seemed mildly annoyed, swishing his tail or giving her an unimpressed snort. But Pip didn't quit. She'd lay in the straw next to him when he dozed, her small frame curled neatly at his side. I'd catch them together sometimes in the quiet of the afternoons. Sage's head hanging low, eyes closed, while Pip lay stretched out on the warm ground, tail flicking lazily in rhythm with his breathing. By fall, Sage had stopped pretending she wasn't there. He'd nudge her gently with his nose when she sprawled in his way, or look up when she darted past him, chasing after a mouse. It wasn't exactly playful, more like resigned tolerance. But it was something. "Admit it," I told him one day as I brushed him down. "You like her." Sage didn't respond, of course, but Pip, perched on the stall rail, gave me a smug look as if she knew she'd won. Winter didn't creep in slowly that year. It came roaring like a freight train. By mid-November, the mornings turned sharp and brittle, the air biting harder than I'd expected. The first frost arrived overnight, leaving the world dusted in white, and with it came the dull ache of worry sitting in my chest. I stood in the barn doorway, mug of steaming coffee warming my hands, watching Sage. He stood at the far end of the stall, his breath misting the air in soft puffs. Pip curled up near his front hooves. I couldn't help it, though. Doc's words still echoed loud and clear in my mind. This horse isn't going to make it through winter. Sage didn't know the odds stacked against him, but I did. Now, in the dead of winter, Sage was stronger than anyone, Doc included, had thought he'd ever be. The scars on his back and legs would always be there, but the dull, haunted look he'd carried with him that first day was gone. His coat was thicker now, clean and brushed, though still patchy in a few spots. He wasn't all bones anymore either, but winter was a different kind of beast. I tugged my coat tighter as I stepped into the stall, the icy wind rattling the barn walls behind me. "Morning, buddy." Sage looked up, ears flicking toward me. Pip stretched beside him and padded off toward her food bowl, leaving us alone. I ran a hand down Sage's neck, feeling the warmth beneath his fur. It was colder than it had been yesterday, and the draft slipping through the barn doors sent a shiver down my spine. "All right," I muttered, moving to grab the thick winter blanket I'd draped over the railing. "You're not going to like this, but we're going to have to bundle you up." When I approached with the blanket, Sage gave me a look, half curiosity, half suspicion, and took a step back. "Come on," I said, holding the blanket open. "Don't be stubborn." Sage snorted and shifted again, his body tensing. I sighed. For all the progress we'd made, there were still things that set him on edge, and this was one of them. "It's just a blanket, Sage," I said, my voice calm. I reached out and brushed his neck lightly with one hand before draping the blanket over his back as gently as I could. His muscles twitched under the fabric, and for a moment I thought he was going to bolt. But then he stilled, head turned just enough to watch me buckle the straps. "See? Not so bad." He huffed softly as if to argue, but he didn't fight me. The days grew colder, the nights longer. I found myself checking on Sage more than usual, as though expecting to walk into the barn one morning and see him curled up on the straw, too weak to stand. But every time, I was met with the same steady gaze, the same gentle exhale of breath misting the air. Pip was always there too, her orange coat a sharp contrast against the dark straw and Sage's pale fur. She seemed to know when he needed company, and she kept close during those bitter nights, curling up against his legs like he was her personal space heater. One evening, as I stood in the barn brushing Sage down, the wind howling outside, I caught sight of Pip crouched near the corner of the stall. Her eyes were locked on a mouse scurrying along the edge of the wall. "Go on then," I murmured, watching her. Pip pounced, quick and silent, and when she turned back, mouse in her mouth, she looked as proud as I'd ever seen her. She trotted back to Sage and dropped it unceremoniously at his feet. Sage lowered his head, sniffed at the mouse, and then looked back at me, as if to say, "What am I supposed to do with this?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Looks like she's trying to share her spoils with you. Better act grateful." Pip sat beside the mouse, tail curled neatly around her paws, her gaze fixed on Sage. After a moment, Sage gave the smallest snort and turned away, unimpressed. Pip, apparently unbothered, began batting the mouse around like a toy. "That's friendship for you," I muttered, shaking my head. By mid-December, the barn had become a refuge against the cold. I spent more time there than anywhere else, tending to Sage, fixing up his stall, and watching as he continued to surprise me. Every morning, I'd find him standing tall, his breath misting the air, Pip curled up somewhere close by. Doc stopped by one afternoon to check on him, and when he saw Sage standing strong, his winter blanket pulled snug, he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be. I didn't think he'd make it this far." I smiled, resting a hand on Sage's neck. "Told you he had more fight in him than you thought." Doc nodded, his expression softening. "You did good, kid. Real good." That night, as I sat outside Sage's stall, watching Pip knead herself a little nest in the straw, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Winter, for all its bitterness and bone-chilling days, finally passed. The morning I saw the first hint of green pushing through the frozen dirt, it felt like the whole world let out a breath it had been holding. The snowbanks had melted into murky puddles, the kind that threatened to suck your boots off if you weren't careful, and the air carried that damp, clean smell that only comes with the promise of spring. Sage had made it through. I couldn't believe it. I stood by his stall, watching as he pushed his nose into a bucket of mash, chewing slowly and steadily. His winter coat had thickened over the months, hiding most of the scars that had once been so stark against his body. He looked strong, maybe not as sturdy as the horses I'd seen in their prime, but more alive than the ghost I'd dragged home from that auction. Pip, as always, lay curled at his feet, snoozing in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the open barn door. She was his shadow now, his tiny sentry who refused to leave his side. They were a mismatched pair, sure, but they made sense in a way that only time could explain. "Made it, didn't you, old boy?" I murmured, leaning against the stall door. Sage flicked an ear toward me, but didn't lift his head, content to focus on his breakfast. I had no idea then that the day would bring change. Change came quietly in the early afternoon, in the form of a battered old trailer rumbling up the dirt road and into the yard. I knew the sound of Doc Harlow's truck before I even saw it, and when I did, my stomach twisted with a mix of curiosity and dread. "What now?" I muttered, wiping my hands on the sides of my jeans as I walked toward him. Doc climbed out of the truck, his old boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He looked as gruff as ever, squinting against the sun, his hat pulled low. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," I replied, eyeing the trailer hitched to his truck. "What's this?" "Delivery," Doc grunted, hooking a thumb toward the trailer. I raised an eyebrow. "Delivery? I didn't order anything." "Didn't say you did." Doc's mouth tugged up into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's more of a donation." I looked past him at the trailer. It rattled softly, and from inside came the unmistakable sound of hooves shifting against metal. "What's in there?" I asked, though I already had a sinking suspicion. "Another one like your boy," Doc said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "Owner passed away. Family didn't want him. He's not in terrible shape, but he's old and got nowhere else to go. Figured you might have a soft spot for him." I sighed, running a hand down my face. "Doc, I'll unload him," Doc cut in, like he'd already decided for me. "If you don't want him, after you meet him, I'll haul him back." I stared at the trailer for a long second before shaking my head. "Fine, let's see him." Doc opened the trailer gate, and out came a chestnut gelding, led carefully by a frayed old halter. He was taller than Sage, broader through the chest, but his coat was rough, and the bones in his hips showed more than they should have. His eyes were calm but tired, like he'd seen his fair share of hard days. "This is Gus," Doc said, giving the rope a little slack. "Don't let the size fool you. He's got more bark than bite." Gus stood quietly, sniffing the air, his ears swiveling to take in the sounds of the farm. Sage, still inside the barn, let out a soft snort, his head lifting toward the noise. I crossed my arms, watching Gus closely. "You're saying he's friendly?" Doc shrugged. "As friendly as an old man who's been passed around can be. He's been on his own a while, though, so don't expect him to be all hugs and kisses." "Sounds familiar," I muttered, glancing back toward the barn. Doc gave me the rope, and after a moment's hesitation, I led Gus toward the barn. He walked steady beside me, his hooves sinking into the soft ground, and when we reached Sage's stall, I paused. Sage was watching us, his eyes sharp and alert. Pip, as usual, sat near his legs, her green eyes fixed on Gus like she was sizing him up. Gus stopped at the stall door, lifting his head to take a long look at Sage. They stared at each other for a beat, two old souls meeting for the first time. "Well," I said softly, breaking the silence, "I think you two might get along." Gus gave a low huff, his breath stirring the hay at his feet. Sage flicked his tail, his ears twitching forward, but he didn't retreat. Pip deciding it was safe enough, hopped onto the stall rail and watched the exchange with lazy interest. I opened the gate and led Gus inside. He moved cautiously, his head turning as he took in the space. Sage didn't budge, just watched him with the kind of stillness that used to come from fear, but now felt more like quiet curiosity. "Be nice, you two," I said, stepping back. Gus walked toward the far corner and lowered his head to sniff at the hay. Sage's eyes followed him, but after a moment he went back to his feed bucket, chewing steadily like nothing had changed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, the two of them settled into a careful rhythm. Gus stayed quiet and kept his distance at first, content to eat on his own and stand near the edges of the pen. Sage, for his part, didn't seem bothered by the company. Pip, of course, made herself the unofficial referee, darting between the two of them with her usual confidence. Slowly, they started to inch closer. Small things at first, like sharing a pile of hay or standing side by side in the turnout pen. I'd catch glimpses of them from the kitchen window, their heads lowered as they grazed, calm and steady. One afternoon I walked out to check on them and found something that stopped me in my tracks. Gus was standing near the fence, his body angled toward the sun, while Sage dozed a few feet away. Pip lay sprawled between them, completely at ease. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me how far we'd come. "Good boys," I said quietly, leaning against the fence. "Looks like you're figuring it out." Gus lifted his head, his ears twitching, and Sage blinked slowly at me before going back to his nap. Time, I realized, doesn't make a lot of noise when it passes. It sneaks up on you in the quiet, wrapping itself around the little things you never think to notice. An extra line on your face, a lightness in your step that isn't quite as light as it used to be. I felt it most when I looked at Sage. It had been years since that first spring when I brought him home. Years since Doc Harlow had shaken his head and said he wouldn't make it through a single winter. Sage had proved him wrong many times over, though he wasn't the same horse he'd been back then. His steps were slower now, his ribs no longer visible, but his back swayed a little under the weight of time. His once dark eyes were clouded with age, milky white creeping in where clear brown used to be. But he was still here, and somehow that seemed like enough. The barn door creaked as I pushed it open. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the wood, warm and golden, spilling across the straw-strewn floor. Sage stood in his favorite spot, right at the edge of the open door, where the morning sun hit just right. Gus was close by, his head lowered as he gnawed on a flake of hay, and Pip, of course, was curled up at Sage's feet. She always was. "Morning, old man," I said softly, stepping closer. Sage lifted his head just a little, his ears twitching faintly at the sound of my voice. I crouched down near him, brushing a hand along his neck. The fur there was still soft, though thinner than it used to be. He didn't flinch any more when I reached for him. He hadn't in years. Pip stretched out beside him, her claws sinking into the straw as she arched her back, then settled again, her eyes half closed. She looked ancient, too, though she still carried herself like she ruled the place. "You're both getting up there, aren't you?" I murmured, scratching the spot behind Sage's ears that he'd grown to love. From outside the barn, a high-pitched voice called out, "Daddy!" I smiled and turned just in time to see my daughter, Emma, run into the barn with her tiny boots clomping against the wood floor. Her curls bounced wildly, and her little hands clutched a carrot she'd snuck from the kitchen. "Careful!" I said, holding a hand out. "Don't spook him." But Sage didn't spook anymore. Not with Emma. He just lowered his head slightly, as if he knew exactly what she was there for. "I brought you a snack, Sage," Emma announced proudly, holding up the carrot like it was some kind of prize. She walked right up to him, fearless and small, and Sage, gentle as ever, took the carrot from her hand. His lips brushed against her palm, and Emma giggled, her nose wrinkling. "It tickles." I watched the two of them together, my chest tightening in that familiar way it always did when I thought about how far we'd come. Sage, who'd once been too afraid to let anyone near him, now stood quietly as a 3-year-old pressed her cheek against his neck. "Pip!" Emma squealed suddenly, spotting the cat curled up nearby. She dropped to her knees, reaching out to stroke Pip's fur. Pip didn't even lift her head, just cracked an eye open like she was too dignified to fuss. "You spoil them," my wife's voice called from the barn door. I turned to see her leaning there, smiling softly, her arms crossed as she watched the scene. "Guilty as charged," I said, standing and dusting off my jeans. She stepped inside, her boots quieter than Emma's, and came to stand beside me. Together, we watched as Emma sat beside Sage, chattering away in the way only little kids do, her voice carrying through the barn like music. "He's slowing down," she said after a moment, her voice soft. I nodded. "I know." The truth was, I'd known for a while. Sage didn't move as quickly as he used to. He spent more time lying in the sun, his body stretched out like he was soaking in every ounce of warmth he could find. He ate slower, too, taking careful bites of his mash as though savoring it. But he was happy. I could see it in the way his ears turned toward the sound of Emma's voice, in the way he stood still and calm while Pip curled up beside him. He'd spent so many years scared and alone, but now, finally, he was safe, loved. That afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, I sat in the field watching Sage and Gus graze. Emma was chasing butterflies nearby, her laughter drifting through the warm breeze. Pip had claimed a spot on my lap, her purring a steady hum against my chest. Sage moved slowly, his steps deliberate but sure. So Gus wasn't far behind, the two of them side by side like they'd always been. I remembered the first time I'd seen Sage, trembling and broken at that auction yard. I thought about all the nights I'd sat with him, wondering if I'd done the right thing bringing him home. Turned out all right, didn't it? I said quietly, my hand resting on Pip's back. She didn't answer, of course, but Sage lifted his head, his cloudy eyes turning toward me like he knew exactly what I meant. I swallowed hard, feeling the familiar ache in my throat. I knew time was running out. I didn't need Doc to tell me that Sage wouldn't be here forever. But as I watched him standing there, his body bathed in the golden light of a spring afternoon, I realized something. He'd made it. He'd outlived the odds. He'd found peace, found family, found a place where he belonged. And when the time came, whenever it came, he wouldn't leave this world alone. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "for letting me be part of your story." Sage lowered his head again, the sun catching the graying hairs around his muzzle. Pip purred louder, and Emma's laughter echoed across the field. It wasn't a grand ending. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough. And sometimes, that's all you need. So here we are at the end of this journey together, and I just want to say, wow, what a story, right? Before anything else, let me make it clear, this story is fiction. But as you probably felt too, it holds truths we can't ignore about love, second chances, and what it means to fight for something fragile yet worth saving. The bond between Sage and the narrator isn't just about a horse and a person. It's about trust. It reminds us that healing takes time, that broken things can be mended if you're patient enough to show up day after day with kindness. Whether it's an animal, a relationship, or even a part of ourselves, love has the power to mend what feels lost. And Pip, oh, that little cat is a reminder that sometimes the smallest companions bring the biggest comfort. What really stood out to me was the humanity in this story. It's not about grand gestures. It's about quiet moments of hope, where a trembling horse takes one step forward or a simple hand on a neck says, "You're safe now." Isn't that what we all need sometimes? I'd love to hear from you. What did this story teach you? Did it remind you of someone or something you've fought for? Drop a comment below. Let's keep this conversation going, because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to bring us together. Thank you for being here. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, take care of yourselves and of the souls who need you most. See you soon.